If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I help writers identify and solve their story problems.
I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and a story editor, and I help women who are writing in all genres learn how stories work so they can finish their books faster and without frustration.
All right, on today's episode, Valerie has gone back into the vaults and pitched The Mighty Ducks so that we can study the villain's monologue. So this 1992 film was directed by Stephen Herrick from a screenplay by Stephen Brill. Now, of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And please help other writers find our show by leaving a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page, scroll to the bottom, and give us some stars. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, over to you for The Mighty Ducks.
Yes, I must explain myself, I think, this week. Well, Melanie, the latest film to join our list of movies that did not age very well is The Mighty Ducks. Thought this was going to be a blast from the past and a real feel-good movie to, pick me up to study in the middle of the week before we did our recording. Yeah, I was wrong. Okay, so I chose it though because it's a performance story, and I wanted to study a performance story. This season, I am looking at the story theory concept known as the villain's monologue. And so I chose films from as many different genres as I could because I want to see how the villain's monologue works in as many different situations and many different contexts as I could. Now, Whiplash is also a performance story, and it is superb. It is so good on so many levels. If you've not watched Whiplash, really add it to your repertoire because you can study it for like anything. Anything you want to learn, you'll find in Whiplash, including the villain's monologue. But we already did that movie back in the first season, so I can't do it again. So I wanted another one, and The Mighty Ducks is what popped in my head, so that's what I chose. Man, this movie is thin on story. Wow. It, as Melanie said, it was published in 1992, but it just reeks of the 80s. My memory is that it was a G movie. It's not, it's PG. And my daughter was watching it with me, and she kept looking at it going, "This is in a kids movie? Oh my God. It's drunk driving. Like, what is happening here?" Now, anyway, we'll move on from that. Suffice it to say that, this is what happens when you have a memory of a movie as a viewer, as a fan, before you put your story hat on, before you decided you wanted to be a writer and you start looking at story critically. And then, when you go back and look at it through the filter of the craft, hey, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Okay, so let's just review the theory of the villain's monologue. Okay, so the villain's monologue exists to allow the villain, and by villain I mean the antagonist generally, to explain why he does what he does. If there's no reason behind the villain's actions, then basically he's a bad guy for the sake of being a bad guy. And from a storytelling perspective, that is boring. It is super boring, super boring. Ideally, your villain has a point. Okay, this is important. The audience does not have to agree, or the reader, in our case, if we're talking about novels, the reader doesn't have to agree with the villain's tactics. In fact, we as readers typically do not, right? Because we don't empathize with the villain, we empathize with the hero. But in explaining the motivation for their behavior. So when the villain is explaining why he does what he does, as the reader, if the author has done it skillfully, as the reader, we are forced to admit that the villain has a point. And whatever wrong the villain is trying to right, we look at it and say, you know what? Yeah, that really is a problem. Villain, the way you are going about solving this problem is not cool, but we admit that this is a problem that needs to be looked at. Okay, so far so good. Add to that, in terms of the theory, the villain's monologue can happen at any point in the story. And typically, yes, it is delivered by the villain. But not always, because last week we saw, if you haven't listened to that episode, last week we learned that actually the protagonist actually delivered the antagonist's monologue. And it can be officially a monologue. It can come some other way. So although I'm calling it a villain's monologue, it doesn't have to be delivered by the villain, and it doesn't have to be a monologue. There's there's lots of flexibility here. The villain just has to make it clear to the reader or the viewer that there's a reason for them doing what they're doing. All right. Now, in a performance story, the villain or the antagonist is typically the opponent, right? And the reason that he's doing what he's doing is because he wants to win too. He's not necessarily a bad guy at all. He just wants to win as much or maybe even more than the protagonist. And we can all understand that. That is not a difficult concept. Sometimes the opponents are portrayed very much as mean, and especially in film, they'll even have a bit of a close-up on the opponent and they snarl at the protagonist, right? At the hero of the story, or they sneer or something like that. But that is one variation. That is a very, very basic, very superficial, not very inventive, entry-level, rudimentary handling of this concept. And where you tend to find it, when we're talking about film and television, where you tend to find it is in like after-school specials or the Hallmark specials. And I'm not dissing the Hallmark channel, but they're very proud of their business model and the type of movies that they create. It's making a whole lot of money for them, but they're not deep, right? That's not the point of them. That handling of a villain is not enough to carry an 80,000 word novel written for an adult audience. It just isn't. You will just not have enough to sustain your story. And the villain is the second most important character in your book. The hero obviously is the most important. Okay. It's not vital that the audience is given some sort of an additional reason in a performance story as to why the opponent wants to win. It is enough that they want to win. It really does depend on the kind of story that you're trying to tell and the kind of cast that you want to develop. And of course, you've got to be careful when you are developing your antagonist that they're not more interesting than the protagonist, because that can happen. Blade Runner, the original Blade Runner, is a famous example. But as we saw a couple of weeks ago on the Green Lantern movie that we did, the Ryan Reynolds version, the villain there really became a victim and was way more empathetic than Ryan Reynolds as the Green Lantern, who's the big hero. The other thing that's really important, or that's really interesting as far as I'm concerned about a performance story, is that often the protagonist is his own worst enemy. It's their mindset that is a problem. The protagonist is holding himself back for some reason. Maybe he lacks confidence, or maybe he lacks skill. Maybe he has tried and failed in the past. There's something like that. So performance stories are one of my favorite genres. They are crowd pleasers. There's lots of great stuff happening there. And they're the kind of story that delivers on a really strong external genre, but also has a really strong internal genre. Okay, great. Now, The Mighty Ducks. Well, as it turns out, there's a whole bunch of antagonistic forces. Gordon Bombay is faced with a lot. So we've got the children on the hockey team. Well, they've had a lot of coaches, right? The last coach that they had yelled at them so much that he had a heart attack. And, life generally for them is tough. They don't have a lot of advantages. So they've sort of had to toughen up to survive the life that they have. One of the kids, Charlie, is an antagonist when he refuses to cheat. He is ethical. Charlie's mom is also an antagonist at times in the movie. First of all, when they meet, because she yells at Gordon for putting her son's life in jeopardy when they're driving around the car on the ice. And then also when the two of them sort of start to date a little bit, she's concerned that if and or when Gordon leaves, that her son's heart will be broken. Then there's the other parents of the kids on the hockey team. They are not happy with the fact that Gordon is teaching their children to cheat. There's Gordon's boss, Mr. Ducksworth. Now, he starts out as a mentor, but when he's faced with keeping his clients happy, he turns on Gordon pretty darn quickly. There's also Judge Weathers. He's antagonistic because Gordon pointed out a time when Weathers was overruled by the appellate court. Like, he's really disrespectful to this justice. And then there's the opposing counsel, Frank, and he is antagonistic to Gordon because when Gordon wins, as he always does, he rubs it in Frank's face, and he is really disrespectful. He even says, quote, "Next time, do your job, Frankie boy." So Gordon's a bit of a jerk, right? So all of these characters are antagonistic to him, but none of these characters are the main antagonist of the Gordon Bombay story. The main antagonist is Coach Riley. So in the Mighty Ducks, which is a performance story, it's not really about how the kids are playing. It's about how the coaches are coaching, which is interesting because there's not a big lot of coaching going on. This is a really thin story. Like, it's super thin. Emilio Estevez is charming, and he has no trouble carrying the story. I was completely distracted by how much he looks like his father. Wow, does he ever look like his dad? And I'm a big fan of those two actors. If I were to do a genre analysis on the Mighty Ducks, honestly, I bet I would find that this is a global maturation story for Gordon Bombay and not a global performance story. I think the global performance story is secondary. But when it comes to studying the villain's monologue, that's neither here nor there. It's fine. It's not a big issue. In this movie, Coach Riley, the villain of the story, is kind of mean for the sake of being mean. He's more than mean. He's abusive, really. The way he talks to the kids is shocking, absolutely shocking to me. I don't know if it struck me as weird or unusual when I watched it back in 92, but I was a bit gobsmacked, to tell you the truth, because the children are so young. Anyway, what does Coach Riley want? Well, yes, he wants to win, right? He's always talking about, quote, going for the W. But I think what he truly wants is to coach a kid that goes all the way to the NHL. Now, I'm saying that. Even as I was preparing for tonight, I thought I'm on thin ice, no pun intended, since we're talking about hockey. I'm on thin ice saying that. I am absolutely willing to admit that I am desperately trying to layer on some sort of depth of character. Because there's not a whole lot, right? It's like eating cotton candy for supper and convincing yourself you had a salad. That's what it's like. We are shown a whole bunch of flashbacks. These are Gordon's memories from when he was a child and how Coach Riley was talking to him. And we're hearing things like the coach saying, "It's up to you, Gordon. You missed the shot. You're not just letting me down. You're letting the whole team down. I wish your dad could be here to see this. Make him proud. And remember, it's not worth playing if you can't win. And it's really tempting to think that that is the villain's monologue. It's not. The villain's monologue comes at the midpoint. And remember, this is a key point in a story. So it has to come at a really important point in the story. In episode 1 this season, the villain's monologue came at the midpoint, right? Here it is again at the midpoint, about 50% the way through the story. So right in the middle of the movie, Coach Riley says to Gordon, "Why'd you turn against me, Gordon? For 6 years, I taught you how to skate. I taught you how to score. I taught you how to go for the W. You could have been one of the greats. And now look at yourself. You're not even a has-been. You're a never was." I think that's the villain's monologue, or the closest thing that we get to a villain's monologue, because I don't think it's amazing in terms of a villain's monologue, to be perfectly honest. Like I said, this is me desperately trying to layer in some sort of meaning where there is none. And this is where I really wished we could have done Whiplash again. And it's our podcast. There's no hardened rule. We could have done Whiplash again if we'd wanted to. There's no podcast police going to come and get us. But we kind of imposed that rule on ourselves when we started, so that we didn't just keep studying the same couple of movies over and over. And we forced ourselves to study widely, deeply, actively, and consistently, right? But whenever we go back to these old movies, my God, they don't hold up. They really don't hold up. It's just amazing. So again, this is where I just start thinking about Whiplash. In that movie, Fletcher is also extremely hard on his students, right? On the kids in that movie. But the kids, they're adults, the university students. But Fletcher is doing it for a really good reason. He believes that the standard for his art, for jazz, is dropping. The bar is lowering and he cannot tolerate it. It just drives him crazy. He loves jazz so much and he is so passionate about it that he wants to elevate the art form. And he looks at Andrew and he sees the potential. Andrew has the talent. He also has the heart. He has the drive. And Fletcher wants him to reach his full potential and be all that he can be. That is a laudable goal. Now, Fletcher's tactics are really not acceptable, but we can all think about that and say, yeah, like we want Andrew to reach his full potential too, just in a kinder, gentler way. Now, in the case of Whiplash, Andrew is able to stay in the game and he does reach his full potential. But Andrew is also an adult. He is a student, but he's an adult student. In the Mighty Ducks, Gordon actually abandons hockey entirely and gives up on his dream completely. But Gordon is a little kid. I think it's the Pee Wee League, right? He's a little kid. And his dad has passed. And so he doesn't seem to have a strong male role model in his life who could shepherd him through that. Like the Coach Riley is the father figure and he's just awful. So Gordon gives up. So Coach Riley is a very watered down version of Fletcher. And I mean a very watered down version. Honestly, I think as a villain, as an antagonist for a story, I think he's kind of lame. And that is probably why there are so many antagonists in the story. Riley cannot carry the story. And remember, the middle build belongs to the antagonists. That's the antagonist's job, is to propel the whole middle build of your story and to force that change in your protagonist. It's a very important role. In Whiplash, Fletcher is more than enough. He has no problem driving the story at all. So we've got similar ideas here, but they are executed in vastly different ways. So as popular as the Mighty Ducks was, it, in my opinion, is the lesser of the two examples. Now, just before I finish, I would be remiss if I did not point out that the mentor Hans has a brilliant monologue. Because even though I'm focused on the villain's monologue, I really want you to be aware that the protagonist has one. Mentors often have them as well. And here's a really good one. Here's what Hans says to Gordon. Riley is an idiot. It's not about winning, Gordon. It never was. Just show them how to play. Show them how to have fun. Teach them to fly. That is what they'll remember long after you've gone back to being a doctor and long after they've stopped buying skates from me. Now, Gordon is a lawyer. Hans is teasing him there. So that is a really good mentor's monologue. So that's something else for you to keep an eye on. When you become aware and when you start to hear these character monologues in a story, honest to God, you will not be able to unhear them. And you'll wonder, how did I not see them before? They're really valuable. They play an important role in a story. Just make sure that your characters are strong enough and that the monologue is strong enough to explain that character's role in your story. Okay. That's all I got this week. Melanie, how did you do?
Well, I suppose I went a little bit better because the turning points are really obvious in this movie. And right. So, and I say that, and that's not a bad thing in terms of when you're studying these types of principles, but it's quite ham-fisted overall. But that's like the rest of the movie. So for the movie itself, it's not out of character for the movie. It does make it easy to study and locate where the turning points are, right, in it. So there were a couple of good examples, although they were, like I said, they were quite overt. But I think when you're also studying a principle, it's really good to go and find really obvious examples and get familiar with what they look like or how to find them before you start going in and finding them in more subtle stories or more masterfully told stories. So I had a good week because it was pretty easy to find the turning points. But in terms of, enjoying the movie, I was probably in the same seat as you there. But anyway, like I said, it is really good to look at this movie and understand what a turning point does, because the turning point, and I've said this in previous episodes this season, the turning point is linked to an irreversible decision. So what does that mean? And that is not as, I've worked out this week that is not as obvious or as literal as it sounds. And I'm going to explain that as we go through this week, because this is really curious. And I got really into studying this week, and it's probably because the turning points were so obvious and I could spend time doing that because I found them pretty quickly. All right, so the turning point is in any unit of story is the hardest obstacle to overcome. And what it does is it forces the protagonist to make a decision that they potentially don't want to make. Right, so the turning point forces change. And the protagonist will start a scene, a sequence, and a story in one place and finish it in a different place. And it's the turning point that leads to them finishing that unit of story in a different place. Right, so in the progressive complications before the turning point, the protagonist is usually adapting and focusing on moving closer to their object of desire for that scene or for the story as a whole. They are making minor changes to their approach. They're trying to outmaneuver the antagonist in the scene or the sequence. But finally, there is a point where the small adjustments aren't working and something bigger needs to happen. And I said bigger, not big, because in the context of the story that you're telling, it may not be a super big, loud thing. It just might be a change in mindset. So just be aware that the change can be It has to be bigger than what's gone before it. It doesn't have to be big. All right, so the turning point is forcing a change along a value scale that derives from the type of story you're telling and also from the protagonist's object of desire. Now, like Valerie mentioned, The Mighty Ducks is a sports performance story, which means that the object of desire will have something to do with winning or losing. And this can be specific to the character. Now, the value scale that most of the crisis points will turn on in this type of story is in a scale between honor and shame. So let's have a look at where Gordon starts the movie. He is obsessed with winning in the courtroom, and he'll do anything to get his clients off. And he starts the movie with very little honor because he is so ashamed of losing a hockey match when he was young. Now, through a series of bad decisions, Gordon is directed by the courts to go into community service, which means he'll be coaching a Pee Wee's hockey team. And this is something he doesn't want to do. Now, the first scenes with Gordon coaching, coaching in inverted commas, doesn't go well. Gordon, because he's so ashamed of losing when he was a kid, trains the kids to cheat by diving because he wants to win at any cost or do anything to win. So the progressive complications in this sequence include Gordon yelling at Charlie because he won't dive. And then Charlie says to Gordon, you can't make me cheat. And it's this idea of being honourable is actually reinforced by Terry and Jesse's dad, who shows his disgust at the way that Gordon is coaching the children. So Gordon's approach to coaching isn't working. The kids hate him. The parents don't support him. He is not doing very well, and he's losing. So he's not doing very well. Gordon's win by any means strategy is shifting him closer and closer to a very shameful outcome, right? He is shifting. If he keeps going down that way, he is becoming more entrenched in a shameful way of behaving or thinking. So Gordon goes to visit his friend and mentor, Hans, who reminds him that he used to love skating and playing. So the turning point is when Gordon remembers about his love of playing and skating, and when he remembers what it was like to be a child. Now, this is the turning point because it forces Gordon to make a choice. Externally, he can keep trying to get the kids to dive, or he can teach them to play and love the game. So Gordon is really making a choice about staying with shame or returning to honor. And the way he coaches the kids is the external expression of his internal belief system. Gordon will either choose to double down on his shame and keep teaching the kids how to lose by diving, or trying to win but lose by diving, or he'll choose to move towards honor and teach them to love skating and love the game, regardless of the outcome. So the turning point occurs just before there is a shift in the value scale, or a shift closer to or further away from what's at stake. So the turning point is the progressive complication where the protagonist makes a change. And pinpointing the change in a unit of story often helps you find where the turning point is. Okay, so let's look at that scene where Gordon visits Hans. He starts the scene lost. His team are disgusted by him, and Hans talks to him about the past, and he eventually reminds Gordon about his love of the game. So Gordon has a choice at this point. He can no longer remain unaware of how much he used to love the game and how much his behaviour is bad for the Pee Wee team, for District 5. So he can double down on his current approach, or he can show the kids how to love the game. So Gordon goes skating and to remind himself about his love of skating and his love of the game. So even though he doesn't make the decision at that point where Hans reminds him, he has a decision to make, and it's just drawn out a little bit longer. So he needs, and because it's an internal change that he really needs to make, he needs to take a little bit of time to actually make that decision. And it needs to be, we'll say realistic, but we'll mean that in the terms of the movie. So I think having a pause where he goes and rediscovers that for himself, makes that decision a bit more realistic for Gordon's character. So this scene shifts from negative to positive. But remember that this is the third sequence of the movie, right? So when that happens, so when Gordon makes that shift, it's the third sequence in the movie. Now, it's important to understand where the protagonist starts from because it gives you an idea about what the turning points need to do from the beginning to the end of the scene, the sequence, the act, or the whole story. So Gordon starts the movie near rock bottom. Now, considering this is a kids' movie, it will have a positive ending, so it's a prescriptive story, not a cautionary tale. So Gordon starts in a negative place, but he has to get to a positive outcome. And it's your turning points that will help you move him from that negative space, in this instance, to a positive space. Now, sometimes characters will start in a positive space, shift into a negative space, and then come out positive, or they'll start positive and turn out in a negative space, which would then be a cautionary tale. So there are options that you have between the start and the ending, and you can decide what your progressive complications are going to do and how your character is going to respond or make decisions about those progressive complications. So as I mentioned before, the third sequence is where Gordon makes a positive choice in response to a turning point. And this is the start of the positive change to Gordon's character arc. Now, another turning point in the story is when Gordon is told to drop his protest against the Hawks so that Banks, one of the players, can transfer out of the Mighty Ducks and go back to the Hawks. So if Gordon drops the protest from a story point of view, he has learnt nothing about fair play and being part of a team, because that is honour in this story. If he does what Ducksworth and Riley want, then he is choosing to cheat again, and the value change would shift towards shame. So to make this scene more dramatic, Ducksworth puts Gordon's job on the line too. So this makes Gordon's choice even more noble, and it demonstrates how much he's changed since the start of the movie. So Gordon actually starts this scene in an honourable place, but his honour is reinforced when he sacrifices his job for the team, right? So you can start in a positive place and end up in an even more positive place by the end of the scene, and that is a legitimate shift in the value scales, right? Which is driven by that progressive complication, or the turning point, sorry. Now, an important question to ask and answer when it comes to stories that sit on the performance genre is that what does winning mean? Now, winning can be a trophy, it can be going the distance, or getting a ragtag bundle of kids who can't skate properly into the finals. So the Mighty Ducks is obviously the last example, but winning isn't necessarily winning the match, although that's a bonus, right? This movie is about honour, and in particular, Gordon's honour. So honour is about staying true to your values and loving the game for Gordon. So if Gordon can be honourable, then he has won. So answering this question before you get to the last turning point, which usually leads to the climactic moment, is important. In a sports performance story, the climactic moment is all about the big performance, the final in this instance. And the final comes down to Charlie's ability to score a penalty and win the game. But for Gordon, it's about how he prepares Charlie for that moment. Okay, so the turning point forces the protagonist to make a decision that should shift where they are placed on the emotional value scale. And the protagonist needs to recognize the change that they've made. And that's what makes the crisis and the climax irreversible. So, irreversibility is actually more about that value shift because the protagonist becomes conscious about what they're doing and where they're shifting to. It is not irreversible in that they can't go back. It is irreversible because they have knowledge and are wiser and are making more conscious decisions. So I mentioned at the top of my section that that's why I would talk about irreversibility. And that is what I meant. It is not as literal, I think, as I have interpreted it before. It actually is about the character's awareness of the decisions that they're making. And once they know it, or they are conscious of the decision that they're making, regardless of whether it's positive or negative for them, it means that they can't then go back to that place of ignorance. Anyway, that was a bit of a eureka moment for me, even though this was the Mighty Ducks. Like I said, watching it and being the turning points being so overt gave me the space and time to actually think a little bit about what does irreversibility mean. Anyway, so like I said, the protagonist can't decide to go back to where they started. And what this means is that they can't unknow what they now know, and they can't undo that decision. All right. So the turning points set up these decisions. And that's a really important thing that I think came out of my study this week. Anyway, Valerie, what is the action step for today?
All right. I want everyone to take a cold, hard look at your antagonist and be really honest with yourself. Is he or she strong enough, and by that I mean well developed enough, to carry the middle of your story? If not, you got some work to do.
All right, that wraps it up for this week. So join us again next week when we discuss She Said. So that's a very big change in pace. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle. And if you'd like to get my tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit me on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about me at melaniehill.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.